Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula, and we're coming off a crazy week in Canada where we totally shuffled the deck, and now we're looking at lineup options all over the place. Zach, what are your first thoughts as we look ahead to Austria?
Oh, first thoughts instantly. Lawson, he's gone. It was not a great weekend for him. I mean, there was quite a few names that it wasn't a great weekend for. But what makes that great for F1 Fantasy is, especially B tier driver wise, there's so many options this weekend. And I think those are the best weekends for playing F1 Fantasy on.
And it was a great week for our co-host Terry, who now is in the top 1,000 in the Global League, and he may have made one of his lineup decisions based on who had the best hair. So whatever works, it'll get you in the top 1,000. So congratulations to Terry.
We now know the best strategy.
As we start preparing for Austria, make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss a minute of our coverage for the rest of the season. So Zach, we've got to start with Mercedes. Heading into the Canadian Grand Prix, we started writing them off because they had that triple header with all the engine issues. And then in free practice, Mercedes really took it up a notch, started dividing the fantasy field of who was going to stick with Ferrari, who would move on to Mercedes. And the end result was 87 fantasy points, which was more than they scored in any race in 2023, 2024, or the first 9 races of 2025. The question is, can they do it again?
Well, this one's really interesting because Canada, of course, brilliant weekend for them. But Austria, especially 2024, which is why I'm a little bit worried about exactly where they'll be. By all means, I'm pretty sure if we look back to it, they were having a better weekend than the Ferraris were. But both Mercedes and Ferrari, it wasn't a crazy weekend. It was then, of course, when Norris and Verstappen collided, Russell gained the win. And that's where a lot of those big points came from. So I do think it's going to go back to a little bit more normalcy where we'll probably see a McLaren winning. But if not, Mercedes and Ferrari probably similar points. So I definitely think when looking to your team selections, it's probably, at least for now, still going to be, oh, do I have Mercedes? I'll just stick with them. Do I have Ferrari? I'll go with that.
I've been doing some digging into the last few seasons because I feel like we've told this story before. So let's go back to 2024. Mercedes was having a tough stretch entering Canada. It ended up being their 3rd highest total of the season as they surprised us by finishing a little bit higher than Ferrari, who double DNF'd in that race. Their 2nd highest score last season was in Austria. And then if you go back to 2023, Mercedes' highest fantasy total was Austria. So I think at this point, we've got to start considering this is one of those circuits that no matter what the situation is, Mercedes may be playing into their strengths when they come here. So I'm keeping a very close eye on them in free practice because that move from Ferrari to Mercedes or into these lineups with Piastri and Antonelli or Piastri and Russell, if you can afford it, could be a big differentiator going forward. I hope we don't make the same mistakes twice.
So, like I mentioned right at the start of the video, this is probably the most excited I am for the B tier drivers in a long time in F1 Fantasy because straight off the bat, minus 21 points for Nico Hulkenberg of 0.6 million and minus 17 for Alonso means they are slap bang in teams. But those two look absolutely phenomenal. They are must buys this weekend, no doubt about it. It's the others that I'm very excited for. We have the likes of Gasly, Bortoleto, Hadjar, Sainz, Colapinto. They could all be used. And I can't tell you the last time we had this debate of, well, who'd you bring in? Because you've got the likes of Gasly, who looks like he needs the least amount of points to go up, 0.2, 0.6 million. But Gasly's had quite a few DNFs. Do I trust Alpine? Then you have the likes of Bortoleto, where he's at 4.5 million. So he's a very safe option, and he needs similar points to Gasly and the likes of Hadjar. So do you go for someone like that who's a lot safer? Or do you go a little bit more risky and go Carlos Sainz? We've seen Williams every now and then be able to absolutely dominate in that car they have, get double points playing positions. And if it's another weekend like that in Austria, Carlos Sainz definitely could be on the list. So there's just so many to choose. I think my money right now is probably on Pierre Gasly as my favourite. Then the likes of Bortoleto, Colapinto, just because they can't go down. And then maybe Carlos Sainz. But who knows? That might change when we start seeing those practice results.
I'm so excited about the cost cap building potential of this weekend for a few reasons. Like you mentioned, Zach, there are a lot of options, unlike what we've had in previous weeks. Usually we have 1 or 2 drivers that maybe need -2 to -5 points, and then the rest of your tier B drivers are at that 4.5 million price floor, so there's no risk. But we only have Bortoleto at the price floor this week. Now there are tons of options that only need between 5 and 10 points. You had mentioned Gasly, Bortoleto, Hadjar, Colapinto, and Sainz all in that range. So I think you're going to see a lot of different lineups, picking and choosing from those different drivers. Then, of course, there are the obvious drivers of Alonso and Hulkenberg. Hulkenberg can DNF and still get a point 0.6 million price gain. Meanwhile, in the case of Alonso, he's off of 36 fantasy points in his last 2 races, and that's his most in a 2-race stretch since Brazil and Coda 2023. So I think those two are as safe as they're ever going to be. One driver that I'm a little nervous about is Pierre Gasly, because we've been in this position twice already this year. Gasly has 2 strong races, and then he's in line for a 0.6 million gain, but he DNF'd at Jeddah and he DNF'd in Monaco, both in this same situation. Now, that doesn't predict that it's going to happen a third time, but he's burnt me enough where I think I'm going to hold off on him this week. And also bringing in Carlos Sainz, he's one of the most popular drivers in the game this season and averaging 8.5 points over his last 4 races. So he's looking even better for a 0.6 million gain. He's at his lowest price of the season, and I suspect more teams are going to bring in Carlos, like you said, Zach, because they're consistently in and around the points.
Now, chip-wise for the Austrian Grand Prix, it's quite weird for me to say, but I can't recommend any chips this weekend. Now, you might be asking, why is it so weird? And it's because Austria normally is that big powerhouse for the likes of Limitless, Extra DRS, but that's because it was a sprint race weekend. And now that it's not, it's sort of in the no man's grounds area for where there's not a sprint race. I don't think there's any rain coming for now. There's lots of overtakes. So you don't really want to be going around Limitless area. And if things like Extra DRS, Autopilot are best to be used later on in the season. So unless your team is absolutely in like a massacre after Canada, that's the only time I could see you using a chip such as wildcard. But bar that, I think that's it.
I took an early look at the forecast, and you're right, Zach. I don't think we're going to have any rain in the competitive sessions. There's some rain in the mix on Saturday, but it should be in the early to late evening after qualifying is complete. So the most it'll do is take off some of that rubbering and make it a little bit difficult on Sunday to get some of that grip, but perhaps the support series will lay down some fresh rubber. Not even that'll be an issue.
But then, interestingly enough, even though I have talked about how no chips could be used, we'll see after qualifying exactly how it'll go. But Final Fix is sort of an option if the likes of someone like Verstappen, Lando Norris, one of these big money drivers who need a lot to go up 0.3 million, do actually do well, but you don't want to be using them in your starting lineup because they will not help you with your budget.
So now moving on into our tier list, of course, we move Russell and Mercedes both up into the buy category because they each need the fewest points in the driver and constructor tier A category. So I think they'll be very popular this week. And remember, Russell won this race last season after Max and Lando had that contact late in the race. So a lot of drama with Lando both last week and last season at this race, and Russell the beneficiary both times.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be so interesting seeing also as well what constructor we pick, because as you can see, McLaren, Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, all in the buy. I think it's the first time potentially this season all of them have been in the buy section together, just because they are genuinely all worth having a look at. Let's say in practice, Verstappen looks like the best. I would be considering, potentially Red Bull could be a constructor if Yuki can just finish in the top 10. Again, if George Russell's having one of those just brilliant weekends he can pull out of the bag, then we'd look, okay, McLaren, Mercedes, same for Ferrari. So I think the only pinned down one right now definitely is McLaren. But honestly, if I see any teams going McLaren, Red Bull, even if in practice they don't look too crazy, I would be like, okay, that still looks fine. Budget-wise, they'll be fine. And you have to look out for that Max brilliance.
I totally agree, Zach. We can't sleep on Max here because he's on 5 straight poles in Austria and was heading toward his 5th straight top 2 finish before that incident with Norris. This is a home race for Red Bull. Max has got to keep it clean because this is the last race before his penalty points expire and he can avoid that suspension. So I think Max could be on for a good race this weekend. And so if you think back to our chip discussion a moment ago, I've got the Final Fix in the back of my mind just in case you start with the McLaren driver and maybe George Russell, maybe Max Verstappen. They come out of the blue and they look really good in qualifying. I wouldn't be afraid to sub them out for the Grand Prix.
So then looking over to our fence for the premium drivers, you'll see Max Verstappen is there. And the reason I need to talk about him is just to clarify exactly what we were talking about, where Max does look like a great asset potentially to have in your teams. But it's very similar to the Leclerc-Monaco situation, where I would only really recommend it potentially if you final fix it. Because Verstappen, he needs 60 points to go up 0.3 million. So realistically, you can't be starting with someone like that. That is driver of the day, fastest lap, race win. pole position and 5 overtake points, which is a lot to ask from someone. So I would say 100%, if Verstappen looks good, it's a final fix option, but that's why he's on the fence.
A weird stat about Verstappen is that he actually leads the grid in driver of the day wins this year. Seems like this time last year, didn't matter how many races he won in a row, we just would not see any from Max. So a weird turnaround this year because now Lando's toward the bottom of the table in driver of the day wins. Moving over to Tier B, Kimi Antonelli is the star of this tier. He starts the week on the fence because he needs 27 points for 0.2 million and 43 points for 0.6 million. So it'll be a tough act to follow after that podium in Canada. And I think people are going to start building into teams with Piastri and Antonelli, starting with Silverstone in 2 weeks. But for now, I'd keep him on the fence to start the week. Meanwhile, an ominous fact about one of the most popular Tier B drivers this week, Nico Hülkenberg, he's DNF'd every 2 races in Austria. And last year, he finished P6. So I don't know if that's a good sign that he's good at this circuit or a bad one that means he's due for a DNF. But of course, I'm bringing Hulk into my lineup this week, so you know what's going to happen there. So this first lineup takes advantage of that Mercedes momentum, keeps Oscar Piastri and McLaren at the top of the team, brings in the Mercedes constructor in case they're really in form like they have been at this circuit in 2024 and then in 2023 before that. It has the 1 and 2 most likely drivers to gain 0.6 million in Tier B, and then gives you some flexibility with that last driver depending on your budget. This team starts at 106.6 million, but you can really go all the way up to Carlos Sainz if you want to move around different assets that you want in that last spot, and also depending on your budget.
Yeah, having Mercedes in your team is just absolutely incredible, especially for just how much you can move around, like you mentioned. Anyone who's basically just starting out or hadn't had any luck building budget this season, these teams aren't expensive, especially for a lot of the other teams we'll talk about. So very much is free reign to everyone to use as well. And then basically, straight off from what I was last talking about, this is what I mentioned. Because now we have such a gulf between some budgets in teams, you have some people who are ready to go to what I like to call the future meta. Because realistically, the general public, I could say, will not be having this team for another race week or the one afterwards. But it is the dream team for basically the rest of the season until maybe you can get free in. It's got Piastri, it's got Russell, it's got the budget building assets, it's got McLaren and Mercedes, all looking to go up in budget and all look incredible on points. And depending on how you can move around your team, you could go Colapinto to Gasly if you have the money, or maybe to Hadjar or to Hulkenberg. Realistically, my favorite there would be to either go Gasly or Hulkenberg, but again, it just matters on how much money you have. But it's incredible to see that people can use these teams, and it now makes sense for always beating every other team on points and getting the same amount of budget.
And if your budget isn't big enough to afford what Zach just showed a moment ago, we can always get into the old reliable lineup with Piastri, McLaren, and Ferrari. Now, in defense of Ferrari, one thing that they have this year that they didn't have in the previous years is the pit stop points. They still lead the grid with 115 pit stop points scored, and just their pit stop points is more than 3 constructors have scored across all scoring categories this season. So it's still a very strong piece of the puzzle for Ferrari's success, and a way that you can still take advantage of 2 of the top cost cap building drivers of the week. So if you are short on transfers or if you're short on cash, the old reliable team is still there for you.
Yeah, and it's very similar to the Mercedes team we brought up right at the start of the team selections, but it really is because, especially budget-wise, trying to get to those Piastri, Russell, McLaren, Mercedes builds or Piastri, Antonelli builds are so important to like your second half of the season. It really is, well, if you've got Mercedes or Ferrari, very much focus on those B tier driver assets first, like having Alonso, like having Hulkenberg, to make sure you're getting those 0.6 million increases. And then if you can move Ferrari to Mercedes, if they look better, do that, or vice versa. And then moving on to a more differential team that I know a lot of people like to use, it's back to the triple McLarens. Now, again, you could sort of replace Lando if he doesn't look too great as well, because a lot of people have lost faith in him. But what makes this team interesting is, and maybe not for the right reasons this weekend, is I couldn't really decide on the second best constructor, because I think Racing Bulls, a little bit worrying. They need 14 points to go up, and on some weekends they don't get this, especially if they get a DNF, they won't get it. So, especially because this team is a lot to do with building as much budget as possible and staying with the points, you need to be getting those big increases in budget. And then you have the likes of Alpine and Sauber. Now, which one's better? It's hard to tell. They both need negative points. Sauber would definitely get you that 0.6 million, but there's a lot of risks to a team like this, and it can pay off. We have seen it pay off, but 100% is a differential, and 100% I would put that 2 times on Piastri. And then the final team to have a look at ahead of the Austrian Grand Prix is a little weird one, especially for people who have been playing all season long. But we get new F1 Fantasy players throughout the entire season. So there will be people who have around 100 million or not even enough to go to the Piastri, McLaren, Mercedes teams. And this is where I would start you out. If you are just starting to play F1 Fantasy, or again, budget hasn't been kind to you this season, I'd go for this. You get the Piastri, who looks like the safest and best for points as an 80-year driver. McLaren, again, best 80 constructor. Racing Bulls, I've gone a little bit more riskier on this time because you definitely need to start getting that budget up while not losing too many points. Then you have the likes of Hulkenberg and Alonso, definitely going to get that 0.6 million. Then the last two are up to you. However, my favorites would be Gasly and Hadjar.
Moving on over to our fan amp picks from Canada, you can see I took home the win this week, making up for some of the disappointment in F1 Fantasy for me last time out. But I'm currently in the lead for this second part of the season. But Terry did remember his race picks. In fact, he sent out a group chat on Sunday reminding us to put his race picks. So thank you, Terry, for that. Congratulations to our gift card winner this week. It's AC148. And if you want to compete against us and win a prize, be sure to head over to the FanAmp app and make your picks for this weekend. And finally, looking at the Fantasy Formula Featured League, another week has gone by and Alpha Team MB is still on top. They had Alonso and Hulkenberg with Piastri and Ferrari, so a nice, easy week for them. But we also had a few teams go hero mode with 3x DRS boost on Russell and the 2x on Antonelli that looked like geniuses. So congratulations to those teams because you had a huge boost in your ranks this week.
I really want to know what's going on in their brains to make them want to do that, but why did it work?
We'll be back this Saturday to answer all your questions. That action kicks off at 9 a.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. BST, so make sure you join us, bring your lineups in your banter, and we'll be there to give you all of the chaos leading up to the lineup deadline. That's all for now. Thank you all so much for watching the show, and we'll see you on Saturday.
Take care, everyone.